You think you know a story about a girl, a town, and a terrible secret, but you don't. Not this one, because in a place like Dry Creek, the secrets have secrets, and the dust, well, the dust remembers everything. It was an August afternoon so hot the devil himself would have been looking for shade. The air was thick with grit, a fine brown powder that coated every building, every face, every last hope, turning the world the color of a faded memory. Margaret Rose Bennett was 20 years old, and she was trying to become invisible. She pressed herself against the splintered wall of Henderson's General Store, the rough wood digging into her back. Across the street, the Silver Dollar Saloon spat her father out onto the boardwalk. Even from 50 yards away, she could see it, the telltale flush crawling up his neck like poison ivy, the whiskey flush, the one that meant his temper, always simmering just below the surface, was about to boil over. She should have been home an hour ago, but the bruises from last Tuesday hadn't quite faded from purple to a sickly yellow, and she'd lingered at the store, pretending to admire bolts of calico she could never afford. Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose kindness was always shadowed by fear, kept casting her sympathetic glances. Everyone in Dry Creek knew about Thomas Bennett's heavy hands. They also knew to look the other way. It was easier, safer. Margaret Rose! Her father's voice wasn't just a sound. It was a physical thing. It cracked across the street like a bullwhip, and every muscle in her body clenched in a familiar, sickening knot. 20 years old, and still cowering like a stray dog waiting for the boot. She'd seen other girls her age, married, starting families, moving on. But Thomas Bennett had made it clear. His daughter wasn't going anywhere until he said so. No man in town would dare court her anyway, not with her father's reputation hanging over her like a storm cloud, a reputation he cultivated with his fists. "I'm coming, Pa," she called out, her voice a thin, reedy thing she hardly recognized. She forced her feet to move, each step feeling like she was wading through thick, invisible mud. Her body was a roadmap of past pains, and it remembered every single blow. The street was busy, miners caked in grime, cowboys moving a small herd through town, merchants yelling about their wares, 100 pairs of eyes, 100 people who would see what was about to happen, and not a single soul who would do a damn thing to stop it. That was the unbreakable law of Dry Creek. Thomas Bennett stood swaying in front of the saloon. His work shirt was stained dark with sweat and filth from his job at the mine, a job he hated almost as much as he hated his own life. He'd been handsome once. Margaret had seen a photograph, before bitterness and cheap whiskey had carved his face into a permanent scowl. Her mother had died birthing her, and in 20 years Thomas had never once let her forget that her first breath had cost him the only woman he'd ever loved. "Where you been, girl?" he snarled as she got close. His hands shot out, grabbing her arm. His fingers were like iron bands, digging into flesh that was already a mottled canvas of purple and green. "I told you supper on the table by 5. "I was just getting supplies, Pa. I—" The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain. His open palm connected with her cheek with a sound like a pistol shot. Her head snapped sideways and the familiar, coppery taste of her own blood filled her mouth. Around them, the life of the town stuttered. Conversations paused. Heads turned. And then, just as quickly, they turned away. A woman hurried her children past, shielding their eyes. The show was starting, but no one wanted a front-row seat. "Don't you sass me!" Thomas roared, spittle flying from his lips. "Think you're too good to mind your father? Think you can shame me in front of this whole town?" Silence. She'd learned long ago that words were just fuel for his fire. But her silence, her refusal to give him a fight, seemed to enrage him even more. He grabbed a fistful of her long, dark hair, yanking her forward. She stumbled, her knees hitting the hard-packed dirt with a painful thud. "Pa, please," she whispered, hating the broken sound of her own voice. "Not here." He laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. "Worried about your reputation, girl? What reputation? Everyone knows you're nothing but a curse, a burden that killed your own mother." The crowd had grown now, a silent circle of spectators. Men watched from porch posts, their faces blank. Women clutched their shawls, murmuring behind their hands. Margaret saw faces she'd known her whole life. Mr. Morrison, the banker, whose wife sometimes slipped her peppermints. Old Sam from the livery, who'd taught her how to calm a spooked horse. Mrs. Palmer from the boarding house, who'd once offered her a job her father had forbidden her to take. None of them moved. They were statues carved from indifference. Thomas hauled her back to her feet, shaking her like a rag doll. Her bonnet fell, pins scattering in the dust. Her hair tumbled loose, a dark curtain around her shoulders. "You're lucky I keep you at all," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "No man would want you, skinny as a fence post, useless as your mother was." The second blow was a closed fist. Stars burst behind her eyes. She fell again, the ground rushing up to meet her. She scraped her palms on the rough earth, the sting a distant cousin to the fire in her cheek. She could hear her own breathing, ragged and loud in the sudden, heavy quiet that had fallen over the street. "Get up," Thomas commanded. "We're going home, and you're going to learn some proper respect." She struggled to her hands and knees. Blood dripped from her nose, making dark, wet spots in the dust. The humiliation burned hotter than the pain. A grown woman crawling in the dirt like an animal, while her whole world watched. She blinked back tears. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. A child in the crowd whimpered and was quickly shushed. The sound seemed to please her father. He grabbed her arm again, yanking her upright. "That's right," he announced to the crowd, his voice booming with self-righteousness. "You all teach your children what happens when they forget their place. The Bible says, 'Honor thy father,' and by God, she'll learn to honor me if I have to beat it into her." He scanned the faces in the crowd, a drunken king on his throne of dirt and cruelty. "Anyone got something to say? Anyone think they know better how a man should handle his own family?" Silence, a thick, suffocating blanket of it. And that's when Margaret Rose heard it. It wasn't a loud sound, just a soft, metallic jingle. The sound of spurs, but different from the heavy clank of the cowboys. Sharper, lighter. She lifted her head, just an inch, and she saw him. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, as still as a shadow carved from stone, the Apache warrior. While the rest of the town shifted and whispered, he was motionless, watching. She'd seen him before, trading furs at Henderson's, watering his paint horse at the public trough. The town children called him the Savage and threw rocks at him when they thought no one was looking. The adults, the adults just pretended he wasn't there. But he was there now. And something in his dark, unreadable eyes made Margaret Rose's breath catch in her throat. It wasn't pity she saw there. It wasn't disgust. It was something harder, sharper, like flint, waiting for steel. Thomas hadn't noticed him yet. He was too drunk, too consumed by his public performance of power. He raised his hand again, his knuckles white, ready to drive his lesson home one more time. The Apache took a single step forward, and in that one silent step, every law of Dry Creek was about to be broken. The warrior moved through the crowd, not like a man, but like water finding its way through stone. People just parted. They stumbled back, creating a path where none had existed, and they didn't even seem to know why. He wore a mix of traditional deerskin and practical frontier clothes, a simple cotton shirt, a leather vest with intricate beadwork. A cavalry pistol was holstered at his hip, a pragmatic addition to the knife that rested there as well. His hair was long and black, held back by a simple leather cord. The town called him Silent Crow. Margaret doubted it was his real name. The stories they whispered about him were dark and vague. They said soldiers had wiped out his entire band 5 winters ago, that he was the only survivor, that he wandered alone now, caught between the white world that had destroyed his and the Apache world that no longer existed for him. Some said he was dangerous. Others said he was broken. Looking at him now as he closed the distance to her father, Margaret saw neither. She saw power, a terrifying power, held in a leash so tight it was almost invisible. Thomas Bennett, his hand still raised mid-swing, finally noticed the figure approaching. His drunken brain took a moment to process what he was seeing. An Indian, walking right toward him, in the middle of his street. And then a voice cut through the air. It wasn't loud, but it sliced through the tension like a razor. Enough! The word was so quiet, yet it carried the weight of the mountains that loomed over the town. It was filled with the force of a flash flood. It was absolute. Thomas's hand froze. Silent Crow stopped just 3 feet away, close enough that Margaret could see the fine lines etched around his eyes. A thin white scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw. They said he was maybe 35, but his face looked as ageless as a rock formation. His eyes were the deepest brown, almost black, and they were locked on Thomas Bennett with an intensity that made her father, for the first time in his life, take a step back. "She's mine now," Silent Crow said. His English was careful, precise, and utterly final. The world stopped. The wind held its breath. The dust hung motionless in the air. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. Each beat a thunderclap in the sudden, deafening silence. Thomas Bennett's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air on a riverbank. What did you say, Savage?" Silent Crow didn't repeat himself. He just stood there, an immovable object that had just met a pathetic force. His hand rested casually near the hilt of his knife, but the threat wasn't in the weapon. It was in his stance, in his eyes, in the simple, terrifying fact that he was there. "This is none of your concern," Thomas finally managed to stammer, his voice losing its drunken bluster. "This is family business. White man's business." "No," Silent Crow said, his gaze never wavering. "A man who beats a woman in the street has no claim to family. She is under my protection now." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd, whispers like dry leaves skittering in the wind. "Can't just... Who does he think?" Thomas won't stand for it, but Thomas was just swaying on his feet, his face a battleground of confusion and rage. "You can't... She's my daughter, my property. The law says..." "Your law," Silent Crow's voice was laced with a contempt so cold it could freeze fire. "Your law that watches a woman bleed in the dirt and calls it family business. I follow older laws." Sheriff Watson had finally materialized at the edge of the crowd, a thin man with a drooping mustache and the weary eyes of someone who'd long ago traded justice for an easy life. His hand rested on his pistol, but he made no move to intervene. He was trapped between his duty to keep the peace and the unwritten rule that you don't step into a man's private affairs. Besides, everyone knew the sheriff owed Thomas money from last month's poker game. His silence had been bought and paid for. Margaret was still on her knees, watching this impossible scene unfold. No one had ever stood up to her father. Not once. The idea that she could be under anyone's protection, let alone this silent, enigmatic warrior, was so foreign it felt like a dream. "You think you can just take her?" Thomas laughed, but the sound was high and nervous. "What are you going to do, Savage? Buy her? Trade some of your filthy furs for her like she's a horse?" Silent Crow took another step forward. Just one, but it was enough. Thomas stumbled back as if he'd been shoved. "I take nothing," the warrior said. "I offer sanctuary. The choice," he said, and his dark eyes finally shifted, landing on Margaret, "is hers." Every head turned. Every eye in Dry Creek was now fixed on the girl in the dirt. The weight of their stares was suffocating. She'd never been asked to choose anything in her life. Not really. Her father decided what she wore, what she ate, who she could speak to. Her entire existence had been a series of commands. "Margaret Rose," her father's voice changed, becoming wheedling and slick. It was the tone he used after the worst beatings, when he'd get weepy and promise it would never happen again. A promise that always lasted until the next bottle was empty. "You wouldn't shame your poor old father like this. Your mother. Your mother would turn in her grave. Come on home, girl. I'll make that stew you like." She looked at him, the man who'd raised her on a diet of fists and cruel words, the man who had systematically isolated her from the world, turning her into a prisoner in her own home. Then she looked at Silent Crow, this stranger, this outcast, this savage who had stepped out of the shadows when every decent person in town had retreated into them. "He's a heathen," someone in the crowd muttered. "No decent white woman would..." "Decent?" Silent Crow's voice cut through the whispers, sharp and clear. He wasn't looking at Margaret anymore. He was addressing the entire town. His English, once so careful, now flowed with a passionate, raw power. You speak of decency? You who watch a father draw blood from his own child and call it his right? You who turn your heads and walk away when she cries for help because it is not your business? Where is your decency? He swept his gaze over the crowd, and people flinched. Mrs. Henderson clutched her husband's arm. Mr. Morrison, the banker, suddenly found his shoes fascinating. Even Sheriff Watson had the decency to look ashamed. Among the Apache, Silent Crow continued, his voice ringing with authority, we do not strike women. A man who cannot control his temper is not a man. He is a rabid dog, and we put down rabid dogs. The threat, though veiled, was unmistakable. The air grew thick and heavy. Thomas's face went from red to a blotchy purple. You threatening me, Indian? I am stating a fact. Silent Crow turned his attention back to Margaret Rose. His expression softened, just a fraction. You have suffered enough. Come with me, and you will suffer no more. This I swear on the bones of my ancestors. Her throat was as dry as the street beneath her. She tried to speak, but only a cough came out. She tried again. I don't know you. No, he agreed, his voice gentle. But you know him. He gestured with his head toward Thomas, never taking his eyes off her. Which unknown do you choose? And there it was, the first real choice of her life. Stay with the devil she knew, the man who would surely beat her until one of them was dead. The man who would never let her go, never let her have a life, never let her be anything other than a receptacle for his rage and grief. Or go with a stranger, a man who might be dangerous in 100 other ways, but a man who, in the last 5 minutes, had shown her more respect than her own father had in 20 years. A man who saw her as a person who could choose. Margaret Rose, Thomas warned, the wheedling tone gone, replaced by cold steel. I'm your father. You belong with me. What would people say? You'd be ruined. No decent man would have you after this. No decent man has her now, Silent Crow interrupted, his voice flat. You have seen to that. The truth of it hit Margaret like a bucket of ice water. Her father hadn't just beaten her. He'd systematically destroyed any chance she had of escaping him. He'd spread rumors that she was simple-minded, willful, unmarriageable. He had built the walls of her prison brick by brick. She was a 20-year-old woman with no friends, no prospects, no future. Just an endless succession of days, each one promising more bruises, more humiliation, more nights spent crying into her thin pillow, wishing she had died with her mother. She looked around the circle of faces. Not one of them met her gaze. They had watched her get beaten. They would watch it happen again tomorrow. And one day, they would watch her father kill her, and they would cluck their tongues and say, "What a shame." And then they would go home to their own dinners, safe in their own lives, relieved that family business was family business. Silent Crow extended his hand. He wasn't grabbing. He wasn't demanding. He was just offering. His palm was calloused from reins and weapons, but it was steady, patient. Choose, he said again, his voice a low rumble. Slowly, deliberately, Margaret Rose Bennett began to get to her feet. She ignored the throbbing in her face, the ache in her ribs, the sting of the dust on her scraped palms. And she did something that would not only change her life, but would shatter the foundations of Dry Creek forever. She reached out, and she took his hand. The moment her trembling fingers touched his, a gasp went through the crowd. It was a sound of pure shock, as if they just witnessed the sun rising in the west. The touch itself was electric, not with romance, but with the raw, terrifying power of possibility. His fingers closed gently but firmly around hers, and with a strength that felt both powerful and tender, he helped her to her feet. Her legs shook, but she stood tall. No! Thomas Bennett lurched forward, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. But several men, Mr. Henderson and old Sam from the livery among them, grabbed him, holding him back. Not out of sudden sympathy for Margaret. She knew that. It was self-preservation. The situation was already volatile. A dead Indian, no matter the circumstances, would bring federal marshals. It would bring questions. It would bring trouble no one wanted. "You're making a mistake," Thomas shouted, struggling against their grip. "You'll be ruined. No decent person will ever speak to you again. You'll be nothing but an Indian squaw." "Thomas, that's enough," Sheriff Watson finally said, his voice firm for the first time that day. The girls made her choice. "She can't make choices. She's simple. She's my daughter." "Not anymore," Silent Crow said quietly. He bent down, retrieving his gun belt and knife from the dust, buckling them back on with economical practice movements. Then he turned, addressing the crowd one last time. "You will remember this day," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the street. "Not because an Apache took one of your women. I take no one. You will remember it because one of your women chose to leave, and you will ask yourselves why." Margaret felt the weight of their stares, disgust, pity, and from a few of the younger women hiding behind their husbands, she saw something else, something that looked dangerously like envy. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin, meeting their gazes. Let them look. Let them see her swollen cheek and torn dress. Let them see what their silence, their cowardice, had allowed to happen for 20 years. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her hands twisting in her apron. "Margaret Rose, dear, are you certain? You don't know this man. He could be—" "What?" Margaret found her voice and was surprised by its strength. "Beat me? Humiliate me? Keep me a prisoner in my own home? Tell me I'm worthless every day until I believe it?" She gestured toward her father, who was still struggling weakly. "I already have that here." The older woman flinched as if struck. "But he's not one of us. You'll be living as a savage, away from civilization, away from a Christian society." "Your Christian society watched my father beat me bloody in the street," Margaret said, the words coming out cold and clear. "Your civilization decided it wasn't their business. If that's what you call civilization, then I'll take my chances with savagery." Silent Crow had moved to where a beautiful paint horse stood tethered, its black and white coat shimmering in the afternoon sun. He untied the reins but made no move to mount. He was waiting for her. "You walk out of here with that heathen. You're dead to me," Thomas yelled, his voice hoarse. The fight was leaving him, replaced by the dawning, horrifying realization of what was happening. "You hear me, girl? Dead! I have no daughter!" Margaret turned to face him one last time. She looked at the man who had been the sole source of her pain for her entire life, and for the first time, she didn't see a monster. She just saw a pathetic, broken, bitter man. "You never did," she said quietly, but the words carried. "You had a possession, a thing to blame for your sorrows, a target for your fists. But a daughter? No, you never had one of those." The truth of it seemed to hit Thomas like a physical blow. He sagged in the arms of the men holding him, and all the fight went out of him. "Come," Silent Crow said gently. "The sun grows low." But Margaret hesitated. A sudden, practical thought pierced through the emotional chaos. "I have nothing. No clothes, no—" "You have yourself," he interrupted softly. "That is enough. All the rest can be found or made." But just then, another voice cut in. "Wait." It was Mrs. Henderson. She hurried into her store, emerging a moment later with a tightly wrapped bundle. "Take this," she said, pressing it into Margaret's hands. "It's not much, but—" She glanced fearfully at Thomas, then back at Margaret, her eyes full of a guilt that was 20 years too late. "I should have done more. I'm sorry." That one act of kindness seemed to break a dam. A few others stepped forward. Mrs. Palmer handed her a small purse with a few coins. Old Sam pushed a full canteen of water into her hand. Small gestures. Too little. Too late. But they weren't nothing. Silent Crow was already mounted. He extended his hand down to her. "It is time." This was it. The final step. The point of no return. Once she took his hand, once she was on that horse, her old life would be over. She would be an exile, a scandal, a ghost. She was leaving the only world she had ever known for a future she couldn't possibly imagine, with a man whose name she didn't even know. But what was certainty worth when it only promised pain? She took his hand. He pulled her up behind him with an easy strength. She settled on the horse's back, her hands hesitantly going to his waist for balance. "Where will you take her?" Someone from the crowd called out. Silent Crow looked back over his shoulder, his dark eyes sweeping over them one last time. "To a place where she can heal, where she can learn that strength does not come from a man's fist, where she can discover who she is when fear is no longer her only companion." He paused, and his next words were a final, damning indictment of their entire way of life. "And if she chooses to return, she will return. But it will be her choice, not mine, not yours, and not his." He turned the horse, and Margaret found herself facing the vast, open desert beyond the town, painted gold and crimson in the slanting light of the setting sun. A wave of terror washed over her, the fear of the unknown, the fear that she was making a terrible, irreversible mistake. But beneath the fear, there was something else, something so fragile and new she almost didn't recognize it. It was hope. "Margaret Rose!" Her father's voice one last time, but it was just a broken whisper now. "Don't leave me. I'm all alone. Your mother, she's gone. Now you." She looked back at the pathetic figure sitting in the dust, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a sliver of pity. "You were always alone, Pa," she said, her voice too soft for him to hear, meant only for herself. "You just made sure I was alone with you." Then Silent Crow urged the horse forward. They began to move, not fast but at a steady walk, as if he were still giving her a chance to leap down, to run back to the prison she knew. The crowd parted before them, a sea of blurred faces. As they reached the edge of town, he spoke, his voice a low rumble she felt through his back. "You are afraid." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she whispered. "Good," he said. "Fear means you understand the weight of your choice, but do not let it choose for you." He was silent for a moment. Then he said something strange. "In my saddlebag there is a small leather pouch. Take it." Confused, she reached behind her fingers fumbling with the buckles. She found the pouch. It was old and soft. "What is it?" "Open it." She untied the leather thong. Inside was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was simple, elegant, and strangely familiar. Her breath caught. She had a memory, faded and dreamlike, of her mother wearing this, of small hands playing with the chain. "Where, where did you get this?" she stammered. "Your father dropped it during the struggle," he said. "He didn't see. I did." Her hands trembled as she tried to open it. The clasp was stuck. He reached back, his hand covering hers for a second. His fingers were warm and steady. He worked the clasp open with his thumb. Inside on one side was a tiny faded daguerreotype of her mother. Younger, smiling, vibrant. A woman she had never known. But it was the other side that made her blood run cold. There was no picture. Instead, etched into the silver, was a strange symbol. A circle with a jagged line, like a lightning bolt, running through it. "What is this?" she whispered. He was quiet for a long time as the horse carried them out into the growing twilight. The last lights of Dry Creek faded behind them. "I have seen that mark before," he finally said, his voice low and hard, like stones grinding together. "It is the brand of the man who led the soldiers to my people, the man who killed my wife and my daughter." Margaret stared at the symbol in her hand, then at the back of the man whose arm she was holding. Her father, the man who abused her, the man who told her she was the cause of her mother's death, had been carrying the symbol of the man who had murdered this warrior's entire family. Suddenly, this wasn't just an escape. It was something else entirely, something far darker and far more dangerous. The choice she had made on that dusty street hadn't just saved her. It had just uncovered a secret that Dry Creek had buried for a very, very long time. And a reckoning was coming. The desert at night was another world. The crushing heat of the day bled away into a surprising coolness, and the sky, free from the smoke and lamplight of town, exploded into a blazing tapestry of stars. They rode for hours in a silence that was thick with unspoken questions. Margaret clutched the locket in her hand, the strange symbol seeming to burn itself into her palm. Her father had this. Why? The question looped endlessly in her mind. Was it a trophy? A payment? A warning? They stopped once, at a hidden spring trickling from a rock face. Silent Crow, she still didn't know his real name, watered the horse and refilled the canteen old Sam had given her. He offered it to her first. As she drank, he took the spare kerchief from Mrs. Henderson's bundle, dipped it in the cool water, and gently, carefully, began to clean the dried blood from her face. His touch was clinical, his fingers never brushing her skin. But the simple act of care was so foreign, so unexpected, she had to fight back a wave of tears. They climbed into the foothills, following trails that were invisible to her, but as clear as a main road to him. The scent of pine began to replace the dust of the plains. "We stop here," he finally announced, guiding the horse into a small clearing sheltered by massive boulders. A ring of old firestones told her this was a place he'd used before. She slid from the horse, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. While he moved with practiced efficiency, unsaddling the horse, gathering wood, coaxing a small, smokeless fire to life, she stood uncertainly, feeling useless and out of place. The full weight of her decision came crashing down. She was in the middle of nowhere with a man she didn't know, a man whose family was murdered by someone connected to her own. She sank onto a flat stone near the fire, pulling her torn shawl tight around her. The locket felt heavy in her pocket. Are you going to hurt me?" The question came out in a whisper, shameful and small, but necessary. He paused in his work and looked at her, his face half in shadow, half in firelight. "Among my people," he said, his voice quiet but intense, "a woman is sacred. She is the keeper of life, the center of the family. A man who forces a woman is not a man. He has betrayed his spirit. You are under my protection. That means your safety is now my honor. I will die before I let harm come to you, from others or from myself." The sincerity in his voice was absolute. It was a bedrock in the shifting sands of her life. "Why?" she asked, needing to understand. "Why did you do it? In the street? You don't know me." He pulled some dried meat and a small pouch of herbs from his saddlebag. "I knew enough," he said, not looking at her. "I knew you were being beaten while others watched. I knew you had no one to stand for you. In my world, that is a tear in the fabric of things, a wrong that must be made right." He made a simple meal, heating water for a fragrant tea, sharing his tough but nourishing jerky. As she ate, wincing from her split lip, she gathered her courage. "The locket," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "The symbol. You're sure?" He finally looked at her, his dark eyes boring into hers. "There are some things a man does not forget. I saw that mark on the rifle butt of the man who gave the orders. He was not a soldier in uniform. He was a white man, leading them, a man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. But my father, he's just a miner, a drunk. He's not, he wouldn't be involved in something like that." Even as she said it, a sliver of doubt entered her mind. Her father was cruel, yes. But was he capable of more? "Perhaps not," Silent Crow conceded. "But he knew the man who was. Or he found that locket on your mother." The words hung in the air between them. On your mother. The story had always been simple. Her mother, weak from a difficult pregnancy, had died just hours after Margaret was born. A tragedy, an accident of nature. It was the story that had defined Margaret's entire life, the source of her father's hatred and her own guilt. But what if it wasn't true? He told me, he always told me I killed her," she whispered, the old shame rising up. "That my birth was too much for her." Silent Crow stared into the fire, his face grim. A story is a powerful weapon. It can build a cage just as strong as iron bars. He looked back at her. "Tell me about your mother." "I don't know anything," she said, her voice hollow. "He burned her only picture. He never spoke her name. He erased her." "Not entirely," he said, nodding toward her pocket where the locket rested. "She left you this. A clue." A clue. The word sent a shiver down her spine. Her life hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a mystery, and she was just now finding the first piece. He saw the turmoil in her face. "You're cold," he said, changing the subject. He retrieved a blanket from his pack. It wasn't rough wool, but a soft, beautifully woven blanket decorated with intricate patterns. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "My wife made it," he said, his voice softening with memory. "I carry it to remember her. Tonight it will serve life, not memory. She would approve." He draped it carefully around her shoulders, his hands never touching her, but the warmth of the blanket was like an embrace. "Where are we going?" she asked. "There is a valley, 2 days' ride from here. Hidden. Safe. Others live there. Apache who will not live on the reservations. Some Mexicans who lost their land. A few whites who chose a different path. You will be safe there. You will have time to heal and time to think." "About the locket?" "About everything," he replied. "You are no longer Thomas Bennett's daughter. So the question is, who is Margaret Rose when she stands alone?" The question was terrifying and thrilling. Later, as she lay wrapped in the blanket near the fire, she watched him settle on the other side of the clearing. He sat with his back against a boulder, his rifle across his lap. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching, protecting. "Silent Crow," she said softly into the darkness. "Yes. Is that your name?" A soft sound, almost a chuckle, rumbled in the night. "It is what your people call me. My name is Taza." He said it carefully. "It means he who walks between worlds. But I have not felt like that man in a long time. What should I call you?" "My friends," he said, a note of old sadness in his voice, "called me Joseph. It was a name given to me by a missionary. He said it meant God will increase. I thought it was a promise. I learned later that some promises are lies." "Joseph," she tried the name. It felt solid, real. "Joseph," she said again. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet, Margaret Rose," he said, his voice a low whisper on the night wind. "The path ahead is hard, but it is a path, not a cage. That is all I offer." A path, not a cage. After 20 years, it sounded like paradise. As she drifted off to sleep under a sky full of silent, watching stars, she clutched the locket. The symbol on it was no longer just a mark of a killer. It was a key, and she was going to find the locket opened. The next 2 days were a blur of motion and learning. Joseph taught her things without ever seeming to teach. He showed her which plants were medicine and which were poison. He showed her how to read the clouds for weather and the ground for tracks. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were full of a wisdom that came from the earth itself. Margaret felt herself changing, sloughing off the timid, fearful girl she had been like a snake shedding its skin. On the third night, as they camped by a stream that sang over smooth rocks, she finally showed him the other side of the locket, the tiny, smiling face of her mother. He studied it for a long time in the firelight. "She has kind eyes," he said at last. "My father said I have her eyes," Margaret said quietly. "I think that's why he hated looking at me." Or, Joseph said, his gaze intense, he hated being reminded of her, of what he lost, or what he did. The next morning they reached the entrance to the valley. It was invisible, a narrow crack in a rock wall, hidden by a thick growth of ancient junipers. Joseph gave a low whistle, like a bird call, and a moment later a man appeared. He was Apache, his face a roadmap of hard years, but his eyes were welcoming. They spoke in their own language, and Margaret caught the sound of her own name. The man nodded and led them through the passage. The canyon opened up into a breathtaking valley. A clear stream ran through it, lined with cottonwood trees. Small, neat cabins and traditional wickiups were scattered through the trees. There were gardens, corrals with horses, and the smell of cooking fires in the air. It was a place of peace, a place of life. About 30 people lived there, a patchwork of survivors. An older Mexican woman named Maria, whose laughter was as rich as the stews she cooked, took Margaret under her wing immediately. A young boy named Samuel, whose parents had been a Chinese rail worker and a Mexican woman, taught her how to set snares. An old Apache elder, a woman they called White Dove, showed her how to grind corn and tan hides. They accepted her. They didn't ask about her past. They saw the fading bruises on her face and understood enough. They saw that she came with Joseph, and that was a powerful recommendation. For 6 weeks, Margaret healed. The bruises on her skin faded, and slowly, so did the ones on her soul. She worked hard, her hands growing calloused, her body growing strong. She learned to laugh again, a sound she hadn't realized she'd forgotten. She found herself watching Joseph, seeing the man beneath the warrior. The quiet grief that always shadowed his eyes, the rare small smiles that transformed his face, the gentle way he spoke to the children. A feeling began to grow in her heart, something warm and dangerous and beautiful. One evening, she sat with White Dove, helping her mend a blanket. She had finally worked up the courage to ask. She showed the old woman the locket. White Dove's eyes, cloudy with age, sharpened as she saw the symbol. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, trembled as she took it. "I have seen this mark," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Long ago. It was the mark of the Cimarron Mining Company." "A mining company?" Margaret was confused. "What does that have to in with soldiers?" "Sometimes," White Dove said, her eyes distant with memory, "the soldiers and the mining companies hunt the same prey. Gold. Land." She looked at the picture of Margaret's mother. This woman, she was not from Dry Creek, was she? I I don't know," Margaret admitted. "I don't know anything about her." "Her face," White Dove murmured. "She has the look of the Jicarilla people. My people before we were scattered. They lived in the mountains north of here. Land that the Cimarron Company wanted. Land that was rich with gold." A cold dread began to creep up Margaret's spine. "There were stories," White Dove continued, her voice barely a whisper, "of a Jicarilla woman who married a white man from the new town, a miner. She had learned your language, your ways. She tried to use your own laws against the company to prove they were stealing her people's land. She had papers, proof." The old woman looked up at Margaret, her ancient eyes filled with a terrible sadness. "The company could not let that happen. They hired a man, a ruthless man, to silence her. He and his men. They made it look like a raid by another tribe. But it was a massacre. They killed anyone who knew about the papers." "And my mother?" Margaret whispered, her throat tight. "The story was that she and her white husband escaped," White Dove said, "but that she died soon after, giving birth." The official story, the story that had been the foundation of her entire life. A lie, a carefully constructed lie. Her mother hadn't died in childbirth. She had been silenced. And her father had been there. He hadn't been an innocent, grieving husband. He had been complicit. He had helped them cover it up. His abuse, his hatred of her. It wasn't grief. It was guilt. Guilt and fear. Every time he looked at her, he saw the woman he had betrayed, and the massacre Joseph had survived. It wasn't a random act of war. It was part of the same brutal campaign. The Cimarron Mining Company trying to wipe out anyone who stood in the way of their greed. "Who runs the company?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. White Dove looked her straight in the eye. "The richest man in Dry Creek. The man who owns the bank. The man who holds the town in the palm of his hand. Mr. Morrison. The banker. The man with the gold watch chain and the kind wife who gave her peppermints. The man who had stood by and watched her father beat her." Suddenly it all clicked into place. The sheriff's debt to her father. The town's collective silence. It wasn't just apathy. It was a conspiracy. They were all protecting a secret. A secret built on stolen land and spilled blood. Her mother's blood. Joseph's family's blood. Just then, the warning whistle echoed through the valley. 3 sharp notes. Strangers approaching. Maria rushed her toward a cabin. "Inside, stay hidden." But Margaret didn't hide. She grabbed a rifle. From the window she saw them. Her father, Thomas Bennett, at the front. And with him were 6 men. Hired guns. And riding beside her father, looking smug and confident, was the banker, Mr. Morrison. And leading the hired guns, a man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth that she recognized from Joseph's nightmares. The ones he sometimes shouted in during his sleep. They hadn't just come for her. They had come to finish the job they started 20 years ago, to silence the last 2 people who could expose them. Joseph appeared at her side, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were blazing with a fire she had never seen before. He saw the man leading the riders, and a low, guttural sound escaped his lips. "It is him," he whispered. "I know," Margaret said, her hand steady on the rifle. "I know everything." She was no longer the girl in the dirt. She was the daughter of a woman who had died fighting for justice, and the fight wasn't over. The valley fell silent. The men, women, and even the older children of this hidden community melted into the trees, rifles ready. This was no longer just a confrontation. It was a siege. Walking Bear, the community's unofficial leader, met the riders at the edge of the clearing. "You are not welcome here," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "We're not here for you, old man," sneered the cold-eyed man, the leader of the hired guns. "We're here for what belongs to Mr. Bennett, and for him." He pointed a gloved finger directly at Joseph, who had stepped out from behind the cabin, Margaret right beside him. "You," the man said to Joseph, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face. "I thought we cleaned out your whole nest. Looks like we missed one." Joseph's hand never moved from the cavalry pistol at his hip. "You will not leave this valley alive, Craddock," he said, his voice flat and deadly. Craddock. The name resonated with cold finality. "Brave word," Craddock laughed. He turned to Thomas Bennett. "See, Thomas? I told you your girl was with him. The last of the Jicarilla whelps." Thomas Bennett wouldn't meet Margaret's eyes. He looked haggard, his face pale beneath the grime. This wasn't the drunken bully from the street. This was a cornered, terrified man. "Just give me the girl, Morrison," Thomas pleaded, turning to the banker. "That's all I want. Let's just go." Mr. Morrison adjusted his fine coat, looking utterly out of place in the rugged valley. "It's a little late for that, Thomas. Loose ends. You understand?" His gaze fell on Margaret, cold and dismissive. Like mother, like daughter. Both causing trouble where it's not wanted. And that's when Margaret stepped forward. The rifle felt balanced and right in her hands. "You mean my mother?" she called out, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even herself. "The woman you had murdered? The one who had the papers proving you stole this land from her people?" Morrison's face went white. Craddock's smile vanished. Even Thomas Bennett stared at her, his jaw slack with shock. "She doesn't know what she's talking about," Morrison blustered. "She's been brainwashed by these savages." "No," Margaret said, taking another step. "I've been blind, but now I see. I see you, Mr. Morrison, the man who paid for the murder of women and children for gold. I see you, Craddock, the man who carried it out." She then turned her gaze on her father. "And I see you, Pa, the man who stood by and let it happen. The man who spent 20 years beating his own daughter to silence his own guilt." "Shut her up!" Morrison shrieked at Craddock. Craddock raised his pistol, but he was too slow. Joseph's pistol was already out. A single shot echoed through the valley. Craddock staggered back, a look of pure surprise on his face, a dark hole appearing in his chest. He fell from his horse like a sack of grain. And then all hell broke loose. The hired guns opened fire, but they were shooting at shadows. The people of the valley, masters of their own terrain, fired back from the trees, from behind rocks, from the rooftops of the cabins. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The hired guns, exposed in the center of the clearing, were cut down in less than a minute. In the chaos, Morrison tried to turn his horse to flee. But Maria, the laughing woman who had taught Margaret to cook, stepped out from behind a tree and leveled her rifle. "For my family," she said in Spanish, "who died on the land you stole." She fired once. The banker tumbled into the dust, his fine coat stained with red. And then there was only one man left, Thomas Bennett. He sat on his horse, unarmed, shaking, looking at the carnage around him. He looked at his daughter, who stood with a smoking rifle in her hand, protected by the very people he had called savages. He slid from his horse, falling to his knees. "Margaret," he sobbed, I didn't want this. She wouldn't listen. She was going to ruin us all. I did it to protect her. From them." "You did it for yourself," Margaret said, her voice devoid of heat. It was just a cold, hard fact. "You let them kill her, and you let her memory die every day that you raised your hand to me." Joseph stepped up beside her, reloading his pistol. He looked down at the pathetic, weeping man. He could kill him. Every fiber of his being screamed for it. This man was the root of it all, the weak link that had allowed his world to be destroyed. But he looked at Margaret. He saw the strength in her eyes, but also the pain. He saw a daughter looking at the ruins of her father. "He is yours to judge," Joseph said to her. Margaret looked at Thomas Bennett, the man who had caused her a lifetime of pain. She could give the word. She could end it. "No," she said, lowering her rifle. "He's already dead inside. Let him live with the ghosts." She looked at him one last time. "Get out, and never come back." Thomas scrambled to his feet, climbed onto his horse, and fled without a backward glance, a man running from a life he had single-handedly destroyed. The valley was quiet again, the silence punctuated by the smell of gunpowder and the sight of the dead. They had won. They had protected their home. Justice, swift and brutal, had been served. But as the adrenaline faded, a new reality set in. Thomas Bennett was gone, but he would talk, or someone else would find the bodies. The outside world knew where they were. Their peace was over. As if on cue, Samuel, the young lookout, came running down from the ridge. "Riders!" he yelled. "Many of them! Soldiers!" The victory had been short-lived. They had survived the jackals only to be found by the wolves. A full patrol of U.S. cavalry rode into the valley, not with the aggression of the hired guns, but with a grim sense of duty. At their head was a young captain, his face stern, his blue uniform crisp and clean. "By order of the United States Army," he announced, his voice carrying over the silent valley, "this illegal settlement is to be disbanded. All residents will surrender their weapons and prepare for relocation to the reservation." It was over. Everything they had fought for was about to be swept away by a piece of paper, by a law that didn't understand justice. Joseph, Walking Bear, and the other men stood ready to fight, to die for their home. But then Margaret did something no one expected. She laid down her rifle and walked forward, alone, to stand before the captain. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and steady, "before you follow your orders, you should know what happened here today." The captain looked down at her, his eyes taking in the scene. The dead men, the armed community, the strange white woman standing in the middle of it all. "I see a band of renegades who have resisted lawful authority." "No," Margaret said. "You see the end of a 20-year-old crime." She looked him in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "That man," she pointed to Morrison's body, "was a thief and a murderer. He stole land from the Jicarilla people. He hired that man," she pointed to Craddock, "to massacre anyone who stood in his way, including this man's wife and child." She gestured to Joseph, "and including my mother." She told him everything. The locket, the Cimarron Mining Company, the papers her mother had been trying to use, the cover-up, the abuse. The story poured out of her, not as a plea but as a testimony. When she was finished, the valley was silent. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. The captain looked from Margaret's passionate, honest face to the dead bodies, then back again. He was young, his eyes not yet hardened into the cynicism of his superiors. He saw the truth. "I have my orders, ma'am," he said, but the conviction in his voice was gone. "Your orders are to relocate a peaceful community," Margaret pressed, "but your duty is to justice. In that man's pocket," she pointed to Morrison again, "you will likely find papers, a ledger perhaps, proof of everything I've said, proof that the foundation of Dry Creek is built on a lie." The captain hesitated. He was at a crossroads. He could follow orders, destroy this community, and perpetuate the lie. Or he could listen to his conscience. He dismounted. He walked over to Morrison's body and, with a grim expression, reached into the dead man's inner coat pocket. He pulled out a worn leather ledger. He flipped it open. His eyes scanned the pages, and his expression hardened. He looked up, not at Margaret, but at Walking Bear. "My report will state," the captain said, his voice loud enough for all his men to hear, "that we found this valley abandoned. The renegades who were rumored to be here had already scattered. We found only these bodies, victims of what appears to be an internal dispute among thieves." He tucked the ledger into his own coat. "This will be entered as evidence in a federal investigation against the Cimarron Mining Company." He looked at Margaret, and for a moment, she saw not a soldier, but a man making a choice. You have 1 week, he said quietly. By the time I send a patrol back here, this valley needs to be empty, as if no one was ever here. Understood? Walking Bear nodded slowly. We understand. The captain mounted his horse. He gave one last look at Margaret and Joseph, standing side by side. Miss, he said, tipping his hat slightly, it seems you found a better life out here. I suggest you keep it. And with that, he led his patrol out of the valley. They were safe, but they were also homeless. That evening, as the community prepared for the sad, difficult task of leaving, they also celebrated. They had faced down their ghosts and won. They had found justice. By the light of a great bonfire, with the mountains as their witness, Joseph and Margaret stood before Walking Bear. They didn't have a church. They didn't have a preacher. They had something better. They had a family forged not by blood, but by choice and shared struggle. I take you as my partner, Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion as he took her hands. To walk beside, not behind. To share all that comes, good and bad. My heart, which was ashes, is yours to tend. I choose you, Margaret replied, tears streaming down her face. To be my home. To build a life of respect and love. To stand with you, always. They were married. As they sealed their vows, the community cheered. They had lost a place, but they had not lost what was most important. They had each other. The next morning, as the sun rose, a long procession of people, horses, and loaded travois left the hidden valley for the last time. They were heading north, toward new lands, new uncertainties. Margaret rode beside her husband, Joseph. She looked back at the valley one last time, a place of healing and rebirth. She was no longer Margaret Rose Bennett, the victim. She was Margaret Rose, a survivor, a wife, a warrior. She had learned that enough, spoken at the right moment, could shatter a world of pain. She had learned that home isn't a piece of ground, but the people you stand with. And she had learned that love isn't about ownership, but about setting someone free. The bruises had long since faded from her skin, but more importantly, they had faded from her spirit. In their place was a strength she never knew she had, and a future she had chosen for herself. Hand in hand with the man who had seen her when no one else would, surrounded by her chosen family, she rode north into the morning sun, free. Thank you for listening to this story. We create these tales of the West not just to entertain, but to remember that courage can be found in the most unexpected places. I'd love to know, what part of Margaret Rose's journey resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want more tales of justice, survival, and the untamed heart of the Wild West, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep these stories alive. Until next time, stay strong and choose your own path.